Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Contact's full year results 2017, my sixth one, which surprises me every year. Usual disclaimer on slide 2, but before we get into the pack proper, I might just talk to the themes that you'll hear us talk about this week and ongoing. Strong operational performance and improvement in lots of parts of our business. The year was really a game of 3 quarters followed by 1 quarter, where for those who follow us closely would have seen we were ahead of the prior year at the end of the 3rd quarter, and then bang, materially lower inflows in the last quarter, little bit of demand, and that's knocked the earnings around in the last quarter, but something we're relatively calm about, and we'll go through some slides as to why we think you can look through that effect. A focus on cash, some definitional changes which will help with that focus on cash, and some greater transparency around the cash spend, partly because we're being very descriptive as to what our future dividend policy will be, and to provide some transparency around spend and what that means for payouts to shareholders we think is important. So I'll just take you through the last 12 months in outline, a bit of the market. Graham will go through the numbers, and then we'll talk briefly about that continued focus on cash and the changed dividend policy and what we mean by some of the words in that policy. So on page 4, resilient cash flow. Oh, I should fast forward the slide, shouldn't I? Page 4, resilient cash flow despite rare hydrology sequences. So you'll hear the word rare, disparate, divergent, all sorts of ways to say there was very little rain in the last quarter in our catchment. Picture losing a 280 megawatt power station with free fuel overnight. And that's what really knocked about the earnings in the last quarter. But having said that, because of the way we manage our portfolio, cash was reasonably strong. Major difference other than hydrology year on year was the boost we had in 16 from the tax credit after we closed Otahuhu. Paying out same dividend as last year, 15-cent final, but fully franked. Graham will take you through it in a little bit more detail. We are moving the interim payment to April, and that helps us with the way we think about the franking profile. But to the operations in the last year, we improved our safety performance only a small way in terms of the headline number of TRIFR, but our culture, as verified by an external audit, has moved forward markedly, so very pleasing there. Engaged employees, big focus of us for us, and engagement up 12 percentage points, which is, against a lot of the perceived wisdom and how much you can move in a year. Customers are advocating for us in greater numbers. NPS went from -3 to +17. And one of the themes through today is a real strong financial discipline, reduction in OPEX on an ongoing basis, reduction in CAPEX, and $106 million of debt repaid. Just a little bit on the market and what we do within the market. No change in strategy. The new board, who are now no longer that new, during the year worked with management to reaffirm the strategy. Strategy is broken into 2 parts, providing customers with choice, certainty and control, alongside our long life, low cost and flexible generation assets. Both of those businesses focusing on cost and spend and efficiency. That's underpinned by a small, efficient corporate office, and very recently got smaller following that strategic review. And we continue to look at ways to optimise the assets we hold. So the strategy review concluded in no real change in strategy, but a great confirmation from the new board that we were heading in the right direction. The retail market clearly stays very competitive. Tier 2 retailers tipped above 10% market share in the last few months. First time those retailers will have experienced what we would say are stressed market conditions. And we saw some reduction in activity through those stress market conditions. But we believe retail competition will continue to be vibrant or vigorous, or whatever word you want to use, and our job is to make sure that our churn is below market in that context. Hydrology actually had two big impacts in the year. The first 9 months, very high hydrology, with thermal generation running at its lowest level for 30 years. And then in the final quarter, on a national basis, slightly below mean inflows, but as anyone who lives in the North Island knows, North Island was way above mean, South Island was way below mean. That meant that we ran our gas plants very hard in the last quarter, of course. Demand was actually marginally down. May, June, July, pretty good demand figures, which tell me that the first 9 or 10 months of lower demand were not that structural. You get a bit of cold weather and appliances are used again, so we did see that demand increase. But on an average annual basis, we're still seeing what you would say is 0-ish to 1% as a trend. It's easy to get enticed by the last couple of months, but it was really just the weather. Prices followed hydrology, pretty low in the first 9 or 10 months actually, and then lifted at the very end, with futures prices, short-dated futures prices responding, and the longer-dated ones lifting a little bit. We manage the variability in these conditions by using Ahuroa gas storage, and you'll see this year really is the first time that storage facility has operated in anger, and we've extracted an awful lot of gas and continue to do so through July. The ops stats are out today, so you'll see that in July's numbers as well. But really, why do we need that flexibility? And here's perhaps the most complex chart, which has got some bastardized keys to it to tell a story. But simply put, our hydro inflows peak at a time when customer demand is low. So to sell those at a fixed price through summer, we need to take on risk in winter. So this chart shows that through October through to February, March, we have on an average basis, our highest inflows, and we match those inflows to customer demand. Customers use more in winter, and therefore we have to fill the gap between the hydro inflows and customer demand with thermal or hedges. And you can see that if you pick the far right-hand side of the chart, normally we're trying to get between the top of the orange and the top of the black. And this year we had to get between the blue and the black. And that just has us run our plant much harder at a higher cost. Now you might say, well, why don't you sell to your winter peak inflows? And that's because we believe there's a better cash flow outcome from selling our renewable generation at fixed prices. So unlike our larger renewable peers, we sell 125% of our mean renewable generation, where they may only sell 70 to 85%. We've back calculated, and for as far as we can go back, this results in a better earnings and cash flow outcome on average over time. And you'll see that that phrase is used in our dividend policy, which every now and again means you're going to have a crappy quarter, and we've had it this year. Having said that, we are seeing a tightening of supply and demand conditions. We think the reduction in thermal capacity has been masked somewhat by high hydrology over the last few years, and it may now be appropriate to take a less hedged position. And we've got probably 6 or 7 months to think about that for our next commercial and industrial customer contracting round. In those stress conditions during winter, we make sure that our balance sheet and our financial position is protected. So we have a number of risk mitigants in there, and we do have a very robust risk management system with limits set by the board and action required by management should those limits be breached. And we have a full range of solutions to those stress conditions, including running our thermal plant harder with stored gas, including some hedges we have with other market participants, some of them conditional on plant failure, some of them just at our call but higher cost. And then if it's really cold and it's really dry, then we've got Whirinaki, and Whirinaki did actually have a bit of a run this last few months. So we can see, looking at this chart, which is a price duration curve, that we have got protection in place for those small number of hours in a year which may put some stress on our portfolio, but all within the financial limits provided by our commodity risk management system and monitored by the board every month. What did that do in the year if we sum all that up? Essentially, hydro aside, we had a flat to slightly improving year, and hydro knocked us about. But Graham will take us through the detail of this in the financial review. Just a little bit more on the detail of our businesses now. We are now operationalising CLV. We see the customer lifetime value through many lenses, but we're now starting to get some results of our action. And we can see that in this chart, higher value customers have higher consumption, are less likely to churn and provide more profitability for us. These are actually our numbers. They're not illustrative. So we're beginning to see that work. As a result of that insight, we did actually change a bit of the portfolio in the year and dropped some SME load at that top end of SMEs. Our customer business also went through a bit of a change this year with its loyalty program. In April, we switched from Flybuys to AA Smart Fuel on the back of a lot of feedback from customers that they wanted more instantaneous rewards. Seems to be working well. 50,000 customers enjoying those instant rewards. Churn much lower than the average portfolio. So a really good shift in the year and a good foundation for, in due course, a broader rewards program. During the year, we did focus on operating costs again, a bit of a theme of the last few years. At the headline, it's flat year on year, but we did make an accounting treatment change to the costs associated with our Heroa gas storage, which moved 6 million from what would have been in inventory through to OPEX. And part of the reason for that was to provide transparency, so that 6 million will come down over time. And then, absolutely as a one-off, we did have some international strategy consultants assist management and the board with our review, which actually concluded in some structural changes which resulted in a fair bit of redundancy cost, in particular the last month of the year. So a like-for-like OPEX improvement of $11 million and a continued focus on that, which I'll come to at the end of the pack. But we'll move over to Graham to take us through a bit more detail.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Good morning, everybody. We'll start on page 20 with a reconciliation of statutory and underlying profit measures between FY16 and FY17. You can see that underlying profit is down by $16 million, or 10%, largely as a result of the reduction in EBITDAF, which went from 523 to 494 million. Depreciation and amortisation was 3 million higher than last year, primarily due to the increased running of our Taranaki combined cycle plant. And you'll see in the supporting materials in the back of the pack that we've provided D&A guidance for FY18 of between $215 and $220 million. This increase is largely as a result of adopting the new lease accounting standard, which has a $4 million impact, and following a review of our asset useful lives. Net interest costs continue to improve year on year as we reduce our debt level and average funding cost. Average weighted cost of borrowing in FY17 was 5%, which is down 0.3% from FY16. On slide 21, we have a little bit of detail on the transfer price. At the half year, we introduced our new segments, customer and generation, and we outlined the methodology we use for setting transfer prices between them. This slide provides a little bit more detail on the approach we take for each segment, a little more detail than we provided at the half, including what we do for natural gas. Slide 22 breaks out the EBITDAF movement into the two segments, customer and generation. Customer was up $3 million over FY16, as although electricity and gas netback was down for the year, the reduction in the cost of energy purchases was even greater as a result of lower sales volumes and transfer prices. The LPG business continued to perform well in FY17, while revenue from our legacy meters business continues to decline with the rollout of smart meters. And the EBITDA for the generation segment was down $32 million compared to FY16, largely as a result of the lower inflows in the last quarter and lower sales volumes and transfer prices to the customer segment. I think this outcome, once again, highlights really why we made this change. You can see the impacts that the introduction of the transfer prices has on the two businesses. First, we've now moved the volume risk as well shared, but we think between the customer business and generation business, rather than simply all falling on the netback calculation as we had it before. And second, the wholesale price risk now sits clearly with generation, whereas the retail margin risk sits very firmly with the retail business. So we think that gives clear accountability for performance in each area. Slide 23 and 24, these two slides provide a bit more detail on the performance of the customer segment. I think the key messages on the customer business so that overall we saw a good increase in the profitability of mass market, although largely as a result of lower energy purchase costs. We also had an improvement in mix and tariff in the SME segment with the expiry or repricing of some larger low-margin volumes. C&I volumes were up, but prices were down, clearly following the ASX. Natural gas was flat year on year. And as I said, the LPG business continues to go very well with good volume growth, although it was impacted this year by the need to import more product during the summer. If we go to page 25, it's the segment performance of generation. For generation, the key messages really are that clearly the dramatic drop in the fourth quarter inflows reduced annual hydro generation by 13% year on year. Geothermal was down 2% year on year due to an extended outage at Te Mihi. And the net effect of the reduced renewable volume is the $27 million as shown in the chart there. But offsetting that, we had lower gas transmission and unit gas costs and reduced operating costs, which clearly overall mitigated the impact of the lower renewables. In addition, but we had lower sales volumes at lower prices between the generation and customer segments, and that reduced the generation EBITDAF by $20 million. Turning to slide 26, as Dennis mentioned earlier, our focus continues to be on reducing our capital and our OPEX and capital spend. And although this year the reported other operating expenses is unchanged from last year, if you make the adjustments that Dennis showed earlier, then there's actually been an improvement really of around $11 million. This slide here highlights where we've picked up those improvements across labour costs, debt management and lower insurance costs. On CapEx, we continue to make good progress in reducing our annual spend. You can see there on the chart, the right-hand chart on 26, clearly that CapEx has dropped fairly dramatically across the last 2 years, and we're expecting FY18 to be around $75 million, which is in line with the guidance we've provided before about long-term CapEx being between $70 and $80 million per annum. Turning to slide 27, you'll note that we're now putting more emphasis on operating free cash flow as a key metric for measuring performance and for future distributions. As part of this change, we've also refined our definition of stay-in-business CapEx to ensure that operating cash flow is capturing all relevant CapEx. We're now including CapEx to increase revenue from existing assets and all restoration spend within stay-in-business CapEx. Historically, some of those would have fallen into growth CapEx, and you wouldn't have seen it in operating cash flow. So we're moving those across to ensure that all the sort of relevant CapEx is included within operating free cash flow. Operating free cash flow for FY17 was $300 million, which is down $52 million from FY16, primarily as a result of the lower EBITDA figure and the tax paid in FY16. The use of gas from storage, particularly during the last quarter, has offset some of the impacts of the lower EBITDA on operating cash flows. Turning to slide 28 on the balance sheet and dividend. The slide sets out where we have applied the free cash flow generated during the year. As you can see from the chart, we've applied $106 million to reducing our debt levels as part of our plan to reduce our debt to EBITDA ratio to below 2.8 times. You can see this is an increase over the debt repayments we made last year. The board has decided to pay a final cash dividend for FY17 of 15 cents per share, in line with last year. But as Dennis highlighted before, in order to better manage the use of imputation credits in the future, we're moving the payment date for the interim dividend from March to April. And as a result of that, we're now able to fully impute this final dividend. Just before I hand you back to Dennis, I'd like to mention the Contact's Green Borrowing Program, which we announced this morning. We've had the majority of our debt facilities certified by the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is a non-profit organisation that provides the capital markets with a credible framework for identifying green investments. So far, the majority of our geothermal assets have qualified for the program, and we're hopeful that our hydro assets will also qualify once the CBI has finalised the criteria for hydro assets. There's more information on that green borrowing program in the back of the pack and also clearly on the website. And with that, I'll hand you back to Dennis.
So just a little bit about what next. In February, we talked about the way we were thinking about our business as a customer business and a generation business, with somewhat different investment cycles and paces. We continue that theme with customer targeting lowest cost to serve and the best experience of the tier one retailers. A continued reduction in cost that will come in a virtuous way in that we'll be able to digitise customer journeys, give customers a better experience and reduce costs at the same time. Well advanced in that. Generation, clearly about operational and reliability excellence. We think there is still some opportunity to reduce costs in generation, but we are beginning to move the team to think about how do we continually lower the cost of geothermal energy. Obviously, that has short-term payoff, but also if there were a world when geothermal were developed, then that would also contribute to that. And we think now that with our experience in-house in decarbonising our own activity, we can extend that into the broader use of energy in New Zealand. Its simplest form might be electric vehicles, but actually we believe there's a fair bit of opportunity in industrial use. As I mentioned earlier, we have now got a very small corporate centre, primarily focused on control and expert advice, with a lot of the decision-making happening closest to value, and we had to make that change to continue on this journey of efficiency improvement. In the short term, some good and bad. Clearly, it was still dry at the end of the year, but we have, in the next couple of months, got mass market price changes going through. We've got 660 gigawatt hours of C&I load to recontract to have the same contracted level as last year. We may or may not contract that based on the value it gives us, but we promise some greater transparency on the roll-off of C&I prices. We've still got a fair bit of C&I load that was contracted during the FY16, that should say, summer, and a little infographic to the right shows the volume that was contracted at relatively low prices. We've got a full year of the 80 megawatts to TY, but you all know about that. Opening balance on storage was 29 gigawatt hours. July was dry, seems to be recovering now with some reasonable inflows, but still not blessed, one would say. And of course, carbon costs us a bit more. But in that context, what are we focusing on? Well, we're focusing on improving the free cash flow by driving cost efficiency, and should be more accurately cash efficiency. Another step in operating costs, with a range guided there for fin year 18 of 225 to 235. The Andrew Harvey Green line, costs excluded from underlying, 0 for next year. A line which describes the AGS operating cost move, and our CapEx forecast for next year of 70 to 80. On a prior slide, we said 75. Now, just to be clear on that CapEx line, other than the Wairaki extension, which is away in the future, that includes everything. We're not, as previously discussed, leaving an option for us to add to that line for plant refurbishments or resource drilling. That's the number, and we'll adjust year on year to hit that number. Now, it may bounce around a little bit, maybe have a low year and a higher year, but that's the number, $70 to $80 million long-term sustaining CapEx. We've set a very high bar for what we might define as growth CapEx, and in fin year 18, the current spend is forecast to be $1 million. So you can see that with this chart, we are absolutely focusing on the cash to be able to support the changed dividend policy. The confidence of the operating performance and the plans we have in place to achieve the targets on the prior slide have given the board confidence to announce a change in the distribution policy, and it will be to pay out 80 to 90% of operating free cash flow as the ordinary dividend, on average over time, once our S&P net debt to EBITDAF ratio is below 2.8. And we will periodically give you updates on where we believe the S&P net debt to EBITDAF ratio is. It's currently sitting at 3.1, but we expect to bring that down in the near term. We will probably at the full year results target the distribution for the following year. We'll split the dividend into 40 and 60% interim and final. That helps us with the profile of franking, and we will frank to the extent available. But clearly, in the long term, we won't be able to frank 80 to 90% of free cash flow payout. But what that means for next year is that we will transition to that policy. We're clearly not below 2.8, but we can see that day. So the board have guided for next year that the distribution will be 32 cents. If the new policy were in operation this year, then we would be paying out somewhere between 34 and 38 cents. Now, the 32 cents for next year clearly is based on what we know today. I'm fairly comfortable with it, and it provides, I think, the right message for shareholders that we're transitioning in 1 or 2 steps to fully implementing the new policy. So with that, we'll move to questions, and we might go to the room first while the phone organises itself.
All right, first question if I can, thanks team. Just around, I guess, a little bit more feel for where you see FY18 perhaps debt levels ending up and what that ratio might be at the end of FY18.
We're currently projecting to get below 2.8 by the end of FY18.
Next question was just around, I guess, the TCC plant and what your thinking is there. I think mentioned there's a $15 million being spent on it this year, which is around the refurbishment, I presume. So that's actually locked in. So you're planning to refurbish TCC?
Yeah, I think at the half year I was still trying to decide whether TCC deserved another 25,000 hours of investment. And I think I commented that that relied on a market response for us to be able to not spend that money and effectively close TCC. That market response wasn't forthcoming, so we concluded we should continue to keep TCC alive. And it really is to satisfy that dynamic of we want to sell our summer inflows at fixed prices, and to be able to do that, we need peak cover in winter. And the peakers alone wouldn't have been enough to provide that peak cover, and the market clearly didn't have capacity to provide us with additional cover. So we went ahead with, so TCC is now effectively locked in. If we were to reverse that decision, which is highly unlikely, we probably wouldn't save very much. The refurb will happen in November.
Next question is just around the LPG business and the outlook for that, because I think the second half I had a sort of a gross contribution of about $20 million versus 29 in the first half. And I know you talked about the imports taking place.
Yeah, I mean, the LPG business clearly has some great franchises in our reticulation network and our branch network. So there's a really strong hold on that market share we have. But because we're not integrated on fuel costs, any movement in fuel costs goes straight to the bottom line. Second half was primarily a result of hydrology. It was so wet that the gas requirements in the electricity market weren't needed. Methanex had an outage in the second half, so you're not getting much LPG production. So although Kupe had a storm in second half on gas, it didn't produce much LPG. The bulk of our supply comes from Kupe, so if Kupe is not producing LPG, we import, and the cost of the import goes straight to the bottom line. The import cost differential isn't as high as it has been historically, though. It's only impacting us by $100 and odd a tonne. So it's actually not as bad as it used to be. There's an efficiency built in the supply chain now.
Okay, and last question from me was just around the long-term wholesale curve, and hasn't really moved a great deal over the last few months. It's gone up a little bit, and it came back down again. How do you see? Are you so surprised by the lack of movement in that long-term curve?
Well, I think I've always commented that the futures price is a function of the cost of replacing renewables when they don't come, like this winter, a function of the long-run marginal cost of new kit. So you would expect an efficient market to come back down to those levels. It goes up in the short term because there's no response one can take. You've got to encourage thermal supply in, but you can't build a power station with less than a couple of years' notice. Somewhat unfortunately, it hasn't surprised me that it's come back a little bit. But it does show that there's some firmness to the number, which is sort of comforting.
So how do you justify retail tariff increases on the energy component, if that's the case?
If you look at Contact in particular, our network costs went up in April, as they do every April, and we didn't increase prices till August. So some of it is really just the reflection of network price increases and an adjustment in line with market. So I think you would see on that CLV chart that we believe some products and some customers earn us less than the wholesale price. So we're constantly readjusting. The competitive market tells you if you're wrong.
What sort of customer losses did you experience in those? I think in the South Island you had a bunch of 3%-ish tariff increases.
Like I say, the competitive market is our benchmark, and we don't move prices in such a way that it will result in, customer dissatisfaction, and customers are dissatisfied when the price is out of whack with market. So we've not seen many losses as a result of price changes.
I didn't see any cost to serve figures in this presentation. I think you've had those in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it was flat year on year at the headline. If you take into account the two one-offs I talked about, they would be down slightly. There was a fair bit of increase in cost around the flybys to smart fuel transition. So to actually stay flat was pretty good given that context.
Does that include all the marketing and advertising costs that we're seeing?
Yeah. Or there's some amortisation of points, which is an accounting standard we implemented in the year. If you think about flybys, 250,000 of our customers were on flybys. So clearly the activity through that period to shore up our position was pretty extensive, and to stay flat on cost to serve through that was pretty good.
So all the bus bags and the television and other promotion of new
All in
products is all in there too?
Yeah. And your app. I'm assuming you've got the app, Patrick. You don't own a car.
App?
App.
App,
The app.
schmap.
The smart fuel points. Fantastic. Get on board.
Oh, I think I have got that actually. Yes.
Any more in the room? Neville?
Yep. The loyalty change, obviously some costs associated with that. Do we have sort of a one-off figure we can attach to that?
2 or 3?
2 to 3 mil? Yep. On the geothermal front, it looks like in the last few months you've been running them very hard, presumably sort of using extra capacity at Wairaki as well. Can you give us some guidance for what we should expect for production this year? Does that come at some expense?
I mean, if we've added a chart we've added a line in the detail on geothermal fluid use, because we think that the capacity factor is not the right measure for geothermal, even though some of our peers may point at a great capacity factor versus a not so great capacity factor. It's actually your use of the geothermal fluid that is important, and the efficient use of that geothermal fluid. And we get very high use of the fluid. And next year we would expect to beat the 3,300 figure by a little bit. 2 reasons for that. No outage. I mean, to me, he had its extended outage. It's 2-year inspection. And we're implementing a couple of little projects which take the fluid through another cycle, effectively. But in the $75 million or 70 to 80, depending on what time frame you're looking at, included in that number is the cost to stay at 3,300.
Except for Wairaki.
Except for Wairaki.
Is there any update on the thinking around that?
You'll be retired then, Neville.
I wish.
I hope to be. No, I mean, it's still early days.
Okay. Last question then is just about gas.
Just the last comment on geothermal, though. We have got. Remember, we had a resource consent change 18 months ago to move from daily to quarterly. We're pursuing the opportunity to move that to annual. So that does give you a little bit more flexibility to maintain the 3,300 through outage cycles.
I was going to say, a little bit of geothermal peaking.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, we have got 5% peaking now. If you look at,
Spare capacity.
well, you can see the change as the quarter ticks over. So we're trying to get that over a year. So that's going through a resource consenting process at the moment.
Right.
Sorry, Neville, on gas?
Yeah, just a question on gas. Obviously, we're quite low on contracts. We're happy with the position. I mean, the last half said no need to contract unless there's a dry period. We've had one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still in the same boat. There's plenty of gas around. Even through these conditions, we've had no problem accessing gas. We've now created a little bit of room in the storage vessel. So during the summer months, we'll try and buy some gas at what a gas producer would say are ridiculously low prices, but where you're going to go. So we're not feeling the need to contract for term. You know, you might see us do bits and pieces, but we're not overly concerned about that.
Great, thank you.
Do you do any long-term work about the possibility of the eastern side of the South Island just becoming fundamentally drier because of climate change? And do you need to do anything about that other than have Ahuroa?
I mean, we don't do a lot of work because, you know, I wouldn't have any cash to distribute if I spent money trying to answer that question. But what we do watch is the pattern of inflows, and we've actually not seen at the average level a huge change in inflows. We see it actually being a bit wetter in winter. If there was one trend that was visible, it's a bit wetter in winter. This winter, obviously,
Didn't
bucked
hold
that
you.
trend. But no, I mean, in an investable time frame, we don't expect to see a change.
It's also kind of noticeable how much empty space you've got out here. Is this you're going to downsize the total size of the corporate office?
Well, we're on for people on the phone. We're on level 1 of our building, which we will drop. We don't need this level. It's also the floor I'm on, and people tend to move away from my desk. So it's not really evident in the numbers year on year, but headcount will come down, and we will be able to take a floor out of this building in the next couple of months. Actually, we'll move out in September. Now, we don't see that we need to have a big media release about move up. Yeah, we'll just shuffle up into the other floors. Yeah. Wellington property with high earthquake code is in demand, so it made sense for us to relinquish a floor here.
Is that a reasonably useful number?
$500,000 a year is what we pay for a floor. You got to spend some money to bring it back to standard, but it is, anything that's got less than an 18-month cash payback, then we go after it, and this would have less than a year cash payback. So part of the confidence we've got in the cash efficiency targets we've set is that we've got a bit of a rhythm going on short cash payback opportunities.
So can we just to clarify on the reward scheme side, you've got 55,000 on AA Smart Fuel. What's happened to the flybys?
They've just stayed with us, but they don't get flybys
They
anymore.
don't get flybys anymore. Are they still migrating in large numbers?
No.
So do you
not
think
at all.
that's the end of it, or do you push harder
Yeah,
on that?
I've got a view that, you get rewards from multiple providers in multiple ways, and one provider changing might not be the catalyst to change supplier. I have both. I have an Airpoints card and a Flybuys card and an AA Smart Fuel card in my wallet. It wouldn't trigger me to change. I mean, we would say this, but we believe AA Smart Fuel is fundamentally better for customers than Flybuys, and that's why we made the change. But no, it seems to be that customers are happy to have multiple rewards, and you get more or less aggressive users of the scheme.
So would you expect then to save a bit of money on rewards?
Not necessarily. We're probably going to extend the scheme into other reward partners over time, so you can think of a rewards wallet as a result of being a contact customer, but that'll happen over time.
But even though AA Smart Fuel is a more expensive scheme to
Not
be in,
necessarily. Not
No?
necessarily, no.
okay.
And we do it on CLV, so if it improves the CLV of a customer to reward them more, then we'll do that. So yeah, it's not necessarily more expensive. It's more redeemed. People use it more actively. We might go to the phone.
For those on the phone, to ask a question, please press star 1. Our first question comes from Grant Swainpole from Craig's Investment Partners.
How predictable,
team.
Grant? Good morning.
Oh, fantastic. Not a predictable result and strong guidance on the dividend, which was very, very good. Thank you. My first question is actually around your distribution policy. Dennis, it appears as though you're talking franking and not imputation credit, so I'm assuming you're thinking about foreign investors. So my question is really around share buybacks against unimputed dividends. I'd like to know what your view is on that. Second question is, I got a bit of a mixed signal through your presentation, and particularly around slide 13, where you talk about even with current stressed market conditions, returns are inadequate to justify holding additional high fixed cost thermal plant. But here you're going and you're investing another 22,000 hours of thermal, and then later on you talk about maybe cutting back some of your load to optimize. So I'm just getting a bit of a mixed signal. Can you please clarify where thermal fits into your portfolio over the medium to longer term? And then finally, just in terms of pricing in the market, you appear fairly confident that we'll get some stronger C&I pricing through October, November when you recontract at 660 gigawatt hours. With water now coming, does that rely on short-term ASX holding up, or do you think that prices were so depressed last year that we should see some push through on that front? And on the mass market price increase, can you give some sort of idea what the energy component of your increase you're putting through on the 1st of August? Thanks.
Yep, I got all that. So buybacks versus unimputed and franking versus imputed. I use the phrase interchangeably, so take no signal from that. When we've asked shareholders their preference on an unimputed versus buyback, you get varying answers. We concluded that the weight was with unimputed, but the reason for the range of 80 to 90 is to give us the option to do buybacks. If you think about this year's cash flow, then that, going from 80 to 100% with buybacks would be $60 million or so, which we think is a reasonable buyback size. With no plans for that, it'll be a combination of share price and investor appetite at the time. But we do think we've got a little bit of space for buybacks. You can see from the current market that the difference between 80 to 90 and 100 is not being spent on anything. It's being put into debt reduction in the short term, but it does give a little bit of space for buybacks in the future. But it'll be a function of the conditions at the time. On the future of the thermal kit, Grant, really the comment on slide 13 was to back justify the closure of Otahuhu. There was, we reran the numbers and said, if we would have had Otahuhu this winter, would we have had a materially better earnings outcome? And the answer is no. We would have just been paying for the high fixed costs of it for a couple of years. And actually running it, given its inflexibility, would have made the market very different. So that was really just a comment on Otahuhu, even with these conditions, was not needed by the market. But given the conditions, it affirmed partly the need for TCC, which is why we continued with the refurbishment. And then maybe your last point is connected to C&I prices. This 660 gigawatt hours we've got to renew, we've got choice with that. Does it go into C&I? Does it go into futures or wholesale markets in some way? Or do we reserve it for the spot market? And we're really thinking through the highest value outcome on that. We do believe C&I prices, certainly in our portfolio, will be better, but largely as a result of the historic contract prices we signed through the last 2 years, not as a result of the slight lift in futures prices. But we are in an active thought process around what we do with that, call it half a terawatt hour, which is the discretionary part of our portfolio. And we think with tightened supply demand, that might be better placed in wholesale markets, which should allow us to be more selective on C&I recontracting, which in of itself should result in better prices for us. So I am expecting a bit of a lift from C&I recontracting, but it may come through the wholesale market. But the reason you're probably getting a bit of a mixed message, Grant, is that it is all quite marginal. This last half, 1 terawatt hour of thermally backed sales is pretty marginal sales. Then on the mass market, Maro, correct me, but the overall energy margin increase is about 1%, and 1.5%, maybe $15 million for the year, bearing in mind, though, that if you look at August on June, for example, most of that will be eaten by network cost increases. But the energy component might be 1%, 1 to 1.5%.
That was very clear. Thanks very much.
And we're in August now with those changes made, and we're not seeing material change in customer numbers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Next one on the phone.
The next question comes from Stephen Hudson from Macquarie Securities.
Morning, guys. Just a couple of boring accounting questions for you. You've decided to early adopt IFRS 15 and 16. It looks like you provided a little bit of guidance as to the effect of that. I just wanted to clarify at the EBIT level what you're expecting in terms of the impact over 17 from those two standards being early adopted. And then just on the mass market, just coming back to some earlier discussion, I think if you put in current futures prices, sort of average residential margins are sort of hovering around about 5% versus sort of a long-term average, on my numbers of, much closer to zero. I just wondered about your confidence about getting those August price increases through, and if you, as a part of that answer, if you can give us an idea of what your energy-only price increases in those price increases.
I'll take the first one. Hi, Stephen. I think the impact for this year of adopting the two new standards will be about $5 million on EBITDAF. That's a mix of the depreciation change and interest.
And then I think you've got the revenue recognition, which you've already put at about $3 million. In your account.
I think it will be less than that because effectively we're going to be rolling forward what we'd already capitalised.
Okay. Yeah.
So they'll be setting each other off. So it's maybe $500,000 at the most, which is what I was kind of rounding it at around 5.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
On mass market pricing, Stephen, just bear in mind we were late out with the traps given the changeover to smart fuel. We wanted to make sure we had all that lined up well. So unlike the bigger competitors who put prices up as early as January, and some of them all the way through till June, we didn't go until August, and we expect the energy margin impact to be 1 to 1.5%. And based on, bear in mind the letters for these changes go out early July, so we've had 5 to 6 weeks of customer feedback on that, and we recently revamped our website so customers can look at a price comparator and change the way they deal with us through the website. And we're not having a material impact on switching or the type of switching. So I would say the mass market price increases are really just bringing us back to market. So we're just playing catch up, 1 to 1.5%.
Okay. And Dennis, that's 1 to 1.5% across the entire portfolio on average.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Thanks, guys.
I mean, most of my comments on mass market electricity, clearly. We've got some price changes in LPG going through later in the year.
Thank you.
Any more on the phone?
We have no further phone questions.
Okay, thank you. So last chance in the room.
It's a bit of a gimme, but what's your sense of the customer appetite at the moment for trying new retailers, or is the end of the golden weather occurred for those guys?
I mean, I think we're still seeing churn to new retailers be reasonably high. If it's not Flick or Electric Kiwi, it's is it Sling? I keep saying Slingback, but I think it's Slingshot. You would get a pair of shoes with your electricity supply. So Slingshot was one of the fastest growing retailers in the last few weeks, which is a bit confusing given...
Your percentage.
Yeah, as a percentage, given the wholesale prices they must be facing. So no, I think customers are still reasonably active. Again, churn, 2/3 of it's house moving. So we see it as the new norm. We just got to be the best we can be within that. We've now got tens of broadband customers as well, so it's quite exciting. So I think we must be done. We'll see most of you during the week, and we'll look forward to that.